A lightning-clear sky. Then every screen on the plane went black. No radios. No GPS. 311 people, silent and terrified, 40,000 feet above the ocean. Then a 15-year-old girl's voice cut through the static, "This is Elena." What she did next saved every single life on board. Watch till the end. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Pacific Horizon Flight 219 was not supposed to be remarkable in any way. It left Honolulu at 6:15 in the morning, bound for Tokyo Narita, a routine 9-hour crossing that this crew had flown more times than they could count. The Boeing 787 was 2 years old, freshly out of a scheduled inspection, every system green across the board. 311 souls on the manifest, families headed home, business travelers half asleep before takeoff, a youth volleyball team returning from a tournament, and a girl named Elena Ruiz sitting alone in 34F with a backpack tucked under the seat in front of her. Captain Diane Okafor had flown for 26 years, the last 11 of them on wide-body aircraft across the Pacific. First Officer Tomas Reyes was newer to the airline but not new to flying, a former Coast Guard rescue pilot with 9 years of search and rescue missions behind him. Between them they had the kind of calm, unhurried competence that made passengers relax the moment they heard a flight deck announcement. The weather briefing that morning showed nothing of concern. Clear skies almost the entire route, a ridge of high pressure sitting comfortably over the central Pacific, winds aloft favorable. It was, by every measure available to modern meteorology, about as safe a day to fly as existed. "Beautiful morning for it," Tomas said, running through the pre-flight checklist. "Don't jinx it," Diane replied, only half joking. They pushed back on time. Takeoff was smooth, the climb out over Oahu offering the kind of postcard view that made even veteran flight attendants pause at the window for a second. By the time the seatbelt sign chimed off, the cabin had settled into the low hum of a long-haul flight, blankets unfolded, headphones on, the flight map on every seatback screen tracking their slow crawl west across an ocean that stretched farther than most passengers could really picture. In 34F, Elena Ruiz sat by the window with a paperback she wasn't really reading. She was flying to Japan alone to spend 2 months with her grandmother while her father, a Coast Guard communications specialist, deployed to a training assignment in Guam. It was the first time she had flown internationally without a parent, and she'd spent the boarding process trying to look more confident than she felt. Tucked into her backpack, wrapped in a sweater so it wouldn't rattle around, was a battery-powered handheld radio her father had given her before she left. Not a toy. A real one, the same model the Coast Guard issued to small boat crews for emergency communications, capable of transmitting on marine and aviation distress frequencies. "You probably won't ever need this," her father, Marcus Ruiz, had told her at the gate, pressing it into her hands. "But if you're ever somewhere and things go wrong and nobody else knows what to do, you'll know. Channel 16 is always monitored. Guard frequency, 121.5, if you're near aircraft. Speak slow. Say who you are, where you are, what's wrong. Somebody is always listening, Elena. Always." She'd rolled her eyes a little, the way 15-year-olds do at their parents' worrying. But she'd taken the radio. And for the last 3 years, on slow weekend afternoons at the base, her father had made a kind of game out of teaching her, proper phonetic alphabet, distress call formats, how to estimate a position without GPS, how to keep her voice steady even when her hands weren't. She hadn't thought much about why it mattered. It was just something they did together. She had no idea, somewhere over open ocean at 39,000 feet, she was about to need every bit of it. Her father had never explained exactly why he kept teaching her, session after session, year after year, long past the point where most parents would have let the game quietly fade. Looking back, Elena would understand it differently. Marcus Ruiz had spent 2 decades around search and rescue operations. He had seen, more times than he liked to count, how quickly a calm situation could become an uncalm one, and how much difference it made when at least one person nearby knew what to do instead of only knowing how to be afraid. He didn't want his daughter to grow up anxious about the world. He wanted her to grow up capable in it. There was a difference, he always said, between raising a child to expect disaster and raising a child who wouldn't be paralyzed by one. So the lessons had continued in small, almost invisible doses. A Saturday morning spent identifying different types of static on an old scanner. A car ride where he'd quiz her, half as a joke, on the phonetic alphabet, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, until she could rattle it off faster than her own middle name. A rainy afternoon when he'd made her practice giving a full distress call into a radio that wasn't even transmitting, just so the words would live in her body and not only her memory. She had complained, sometimes. Most teenagers would have. But some quiet part of her had always liked it, liked having something that was just theirs, a shared language between her and her father that nobody else at school would ever understand or care about. She thought about all of that now, sitting in 34F with a book she wasn't reading, watching the wing outside her window slice cleanly through empty blue sky, 30,000 feet above an ocean that didn't care one bit how prepared or unprepared anyone flying over it happened to be. She had absolutely no idea that in a little under 2 hours, all of it, every Saturday morning, every quiz in the car, every rainy afternoon of practice she'd only half wanted to do, would matter more than anything else she had ever learned in her life. 2 hours and 11 minutes into the flight, with the aircraft cruising smoothly and dinner service just beginning, something happened that none of the instruments on board had a name for. It wasn't a storm. There was no storm within 400 miles. It wasn't turbulence. The air was glass smooth. What happened was a sudden, violent surge that rippled through the aircraft's electrical systems all at once, a flash of white light outside the cockpit windows so bright that both pilots instinctively shut their eyes, followed by a sound less like a bang and more like a physical pressure wave pushing through the airframe. And then, silence. Not the ordinary silence of a quiet cabin. A wrong silence. The engines were still running, passengers could feel that much, the steady thrum beneath their feet, but every screen in the cabin went black in the same instant. The overhead lighting died. The seatbelt sign, usually glowing amber or off, simply vanished. In the galley, the coffee makers stopped mid-brew. In the cockpit, it was worse. Every primary flight display went dark. The navigation systems died. The radios, all of them, primary and backup, fell silent. Even the standby instruments, the ones specifically designed to survive a total electrical failure by running on an isolated battery, showed nothing. What just happened? Diane said, her hands instinctively tightening on the yoke even though the autopilot, whatever was left of it, was still technically flying the aircraft. Tomas was scanning the panel, flipping switches that produced no response. Everything's dead. Captain, I mean everything. Primary, backup, standby, all of it. That's not possible. We have triple redundancy on everything. I know what we have. I'm telling you what I'm seeing. He tried the auxiliary power unit. Nothing. He tried the emergency radio panel, the one wired directly to its own dedicated battery specifically so it could never fail even in a total electrical loss. Nothing. Diane felt something cold settle into her stomach, the particular fear of a pilot who has just watched every backup system fail at once, a scenario so statistically unlikely that no training simulator had ever bothered to model it. We still have engines, she said, thinking out loud, forcing herself into procedure. We can hold heading and altitude by visual reference. Sun's behind us, so west is roughly ahead. We can fly the airplane. We just can't talk to anyone, and we can't navigate precisely, and in a few hours we're going to need to find an airport we can't see and can't call. Tomas didn't answer right away. Both of them understood the shape of the problem without needing to say it aloud, 311 people, an ocean with no roads, and an aircraft that had just become, for all practical purposes, deaf, mute, and blind. In the cabin, the reaction was immediate and physical. The abrupt darkness, the dead screens, the sudden absence of the low electronic hum passengers don't consciously notice until it's gone. It registered in bodies before it registered in minds. Someone near the front screamed. A toddler began crying, then another. A man in row 12 stood up so fast his seatbelt caught him mid-motion. Flight attendant Priya Nair grabbed the handheld megaphone from the forward galley, one of the only pieces of equipment on the aircraft not dependent on ship's power, and began speaking in the calmest voice she could manage. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats. We are experiencing an electrical issue. The flight crew is addressing it. The aircraft is flying normally. Please stay calm and remain seated." It bought a few minutes of composure. It did nothing to solve the actual problem. In row 22, a retired airline captain named Robert Hale, flying home from his granddaughter's wedding, unbuckled anyway and made his way carefully toward the forward galley, moving against the current of anxious passengers. 31 years flying wide-body jets had taught him what total electrical failure meant, and it wasn't good. "I used to fly these," he told Priya quietly. "This isn't a light bulb problem. This is everything." "I know," she said. "I don't know what to do about it." Neither, at that moment, did anyone else on the aircraft. Behind the cockpit door, 311 people sat in a darkness that felt far larger than the cabin around them. A businessman in first class kept pressing the flight attendant call button, not realizing it no longer worked, the small chime that should have sounded simply swallowed by silence. A young couple in row 9, married only 2 weeks earlier, gripped each other's hands so tightly their knuckles went white, neither one saying the thought sitting behind both their eyes. Near the back, the youth volleyball team, 12 teenagers and 2 exhausted chaperones flying home from a tournament in Honolulu, had gone eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when a group of loud, confident young people suddenly understands, all at once, that they are not in control of anything happening to them. An elderly man in 27C, traveling to Japan for the first time since his own military service there decades earlier, closed his eyes and began, very softly, to pray in a language none of the passengers around him recognized. A mother 2 rows up turned around instinctively at the sound, met his eyes for a brief second, and found something steadying in it despite not understanding a single word. Priya's megaphone announcement helped for exactly as long as it took people to remember that "the crew is working to resolve it" wasn't actually an answer to anything. Murmurs built into open questions shouted down the aisle. A man near the emergency exit stood and demanded, to no one in particular, why nobody was telling them what was actually wrong. Neither, at that moment, did anyone else on the aircraft have an answer for him. Except, in seat 34F, a 15-year-old girl had already unzipped her backpack and was pulling a sweater-wrapped radio into her lap with hands that were shaking more than she wanted them to. Elena's first instinct was fear, plain and simple, the same fear rippling through everyone around her. But underneath it, quieter, was something her father had spent 3 years building into her without either of them fully realizing it, a next step. A procedure. A thing to do instead of a thing to feel. She unwrapped the radio. Checked the battery indicator, nearly full, she'd charged it the night before out of habit more than expectation. She thought about standing up and asking a flight attendant, then thought better of it, there wasn't time to explain, and every minute the aircraft flew without anyone on the ground knowing it was in trouble was a minute further from help. She turned the radio on. Set it to 121.5, the aviation emergency frequency her father had drilled into her more times than she could count. Guard frequency. Somebody is always listening. Her hands were shaking so hard she almost dropped the unit reaching for the transmit button. She keyed the mic. Hello? Is anyone listening? This is," her voice cracked, and she forced herself to breathe the way her father had shown her, slow, from the stomach, not the throat. "This is Elena Ruiz. I'm a passenger on Pacific Horizon Flight 219. We've lost all our electrical systems. The pilots can't talk to anyone. We need help." She released the button. Static hissed back. Nothing. She looked down at the radio, at her own reflection faint in its dark plastic casing, and heard her father's voice in her memory as clearly as if he were sitting beside her, "Try again. Somebody is always listening. You just have to be patient and clear." She keyed the mic a second time, steadier now. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Pacific Horizon Flight 219, relayed by passenger Elena Ruiz. Aircraft has suffered total electrical failure. No navigation, no radio contact from the cockpit. Approximately 311 persons on board. We are somewhere over the Central Pacific. If anyone can hear this, please respond." 3 seconds of static. Then 4. Then, breaking through faint and distant but unmistakably real, a voice. "Station calling Mayday, this is U.S. Coast Guard C-130, call sign Rescue 21. Say again your last transmission, over." Elena's breath caught so hard she nearly dropped the radio again. This is Elena Ruiz. I'm a passenger on Pacific Horizon Flight 219. We've lost all electrical power. The pilots have no radios, no instruments. We need help. Please." There was a pause on the other end just long enough for her heart to drop, and then the voice came back, careful, focused. "Copy that, Elena. This is Lieutenant Commander Aaron Bell. I hear you loud and clear. I need you to stay calm and stay on this frequency. Can you do that for me?" "Yes. Yes, I can." "Good. You're doing great. Now tell me, how do you know how to work that radio?" Elena almost laughed, the sound coming out somewhere between a sob and disbelief. "My dad taught me. He's Coast Guard. Marcus Ruiz. He gave me this radio before I left Honolulu." There was a beat of silence on the other end that Elena would later learn was Lieutenant Commander Bell sitting bolt upright in his seat, because he knew that name. Marcus Ruiz had trained half the junior communications specialists on the Western Pacific rotation, Bell included, 4 years earlier. "Elena, I know your father," Bell said. "He trained me. And right now, I need you to trust everything he taught you, because you're about to save every single person on that airplane. Can you get this radio to your cockpit crew?" I think so. I don't know if the intercom works." "That's fine. You're going to be the relay. You talk to me, I tell you what to say to the pilots, you carry it forward. Can you do that?" Elena looked down the darkened aisle toward the cockpit door, 311 strangers between her and it, all of them frightened, none of them knowing that the answer to their survival was sitting in the last row of coach in the hands of a 15-year-old. "Yes, sir," she said. "I can do that." What followed was 3 hours and 9 minutes during which Elena Ruiz became, in the words of one investigator who later reviewed the recordings, the single point of failure that didn't fail. She unbuckled and made her way forward, radio clutched against her chest, Priya Nair meeting her halfway down the aisle with a look of confusion that dissolved into astonishment as Elena explained, breathless, what she was carrying. "You have contact. With someone? Coast Guard. A rescue plane. I need to get to the cockpit." Priya didn't hesitate. She led Elena forward past Robert Hale, who stared at the radio in the girl's hands like he was looking at something out of a dream, and knocked the coded sequence on the flight deck door. Captain Okafor cracked the door, exhaustion and controlled panic etched into her face, and found herself looking at a teenager holding a handheld radio. "Captain, this is Elena," Priya said. "She's in contact with a Coast Guard aircraft. She can relay for us." For a fraction of a second, Diane Okafor's professional instincts warred with sheer disbelief. Then she stepped back and let the girl in. "Tell them our position estimate," Diane said immediately. "Tell them we've been holding heading 270 based on the sun, altitude estimated at flight level 390, we don't know our exact position, we've been flying dead reckoning for about 40 minutes. Elena keyed the mic, repeating it as precisely as she could, her voice steadier now that she had something concrete to say. Bell's voice came back almost immediately. Copy all that, Elena. Good work. Tell your captain we have her on radar. We picked up her transponder's last known track before it dropped out, and we've triangulated approximate position from that. Tell her to hold 270, we are vectoring toward her position now, ETA to visual contact approximately 40 minutes. Elena relayed it word for word. Diane exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. Tell him thank you, she said. Tell him we don't know how long our fuel reserve gives us before we need to descend. Back and forth it went. Elena ran, twice tripping over a serving cart Priya had shoved into the galley, between the cockpit and wherever the signal came through clearest, relaying headings, relaying fuel estimates, relaying the slow, careful instructions of a Coast Guard aircraft commander who had, over the course of the crossing, begun addressing her less like a passenger and more like a junior crew member. You're doing exactly what your father would do, Bell told her at one point, during a lull while the C-130 closed the distance. He'd be proud of you right now. I mean that. Elena didn't answer. She was too busy blinking back tears and trying to keep her voice from shaking on the next transmission. Somewhere in the middle of the second hour, Bell asked Elena to confirm the aircraft's fuel status, and Diane's answer, relayed word for word, carried a weight that even Elena, exhausted and focused as she was, could feel land heavily in the cockpit. She says approximately 2 hours 10 minutes of fuel remaining, Elena said into the radio, glancing at Diane, who nodded once, tightly, and said nothing else. Copy that. We're closing the gap faster than planned. Tailwinds in your favor. Tell your captain that's good news, she has more margin than she thinks. Elena relayed it. She watched something in Diane's shoulders ease, just slightly, the smallest fraction of the tension in the cockpit letting go. It was around this time that Tomas, working the yoke opposite Diane while she rested her hands for a moment, glanced back at the teenager standing in the cockpit doorway, radio pressed to her ear, notebook nowhere in sight because she hadn't thought to bring one, holding an entire flight's worth of critical information in her memory instead. How old are you? He asked, not unkindly, mostly out of disbelief. 15, Elena said, not looking up from the radio. You're doing better under pressure than half the pilots I trained with, Tomas said. Elena almost smiled. She didn't have the energy to hold on to it for long. There was another transmission coming through, another heading to relay, another trip back down the aisle to make. By the second hour, word had spread through the cabin, quietly at first, then unmistakably, that the 15-year-old in 34F was somehow talking to a rescue plane. Passengers who had spent the first hour in white-knuckled silence began, in small ways, to breathe again. A grandmother 3 rows from the galley pressed her rosary to her lips and murmured a prayer of thanks toward the back of the aircraft. The youth volleyball team, huddled together near row 19, started quietly chanting Elena's name every time she passed, not loud enough to be a distraction, just enough for her to hear it and feel, for a moment, less alone. At 2 hours and 50 minutes, the radio's battery indicator dropped below 20%, and Elena's stomach dropped with it. She keyed the mic, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. Rescue 2-1, this is Elena. My battery's getting low. Maybe 20 minutes left, I don't know exactly. There was the briefest pause. Copy, Elena. We have visual on your aircraft. I say again, we have visual. You are not alone anymore. I need you to relay one more heading change, then you can rest that radio. Diane, watching from the cockpit window, saw it first, a speck against the pale sky that resolved, agonizingly slowly, into the unmistakable silhouette of a Coast Guard C-130, sliding into formation off their left wing close enough that she could see the crew inside waving. Marcus, she said to Tomas, voice cracking, we're not alone. Tomas didn't answer. He was watching the same thing, and for the first time in nearly 3 hours, he let himself believe they might actually make it home. The C-130 couldn't fix the 787's electrical system. What it could do was fly close enough to guide it, a role no different, in principle, than the fighter escorts that have talked blind airliners home in emergencies before, except this time the intermediary carrying every instruction wasn't a controller in a tower but a 15-year-old girl with a dying radio in the back of an economy cabin. Bell talked Elena through the final approach instructions with the patience of a man who had spent a career training people to function under pressure. She relayed headings. She relayed the C-130's altitude calls, translated through her own increasingly hoarse voice into something the cockpit crew could act on. Diane Hand flew the final descent using nothing but the horizon, the ocean, and the wing of the aircraft off her shoulder as reference. At 4% battery, with Wake Island's runway lights finally visible ahead, a diversion airfield the C-130 crew had identified as the nearest usable strip, Elena keyed the mic one last time. Rescue 2-1, this is Elena. Battery's almost gone. I think this might be my last transmission. Copy, Elena, Bell said, and even through the static, the emotion in his voice was unmistakable. You have done something today most trained professionals never have to do in their entire careers. You kept your head. You kept your voice steady. You brought 311 people home. Your father is going to hear about this before you even land, I promise you that. Rescue 2-1, out. The radio died in her hand a moment later. She didn't need it anymore. Diane Okafor brought the aircraft down onto the runway at Wake Island with a firmness that spoke less of fear than of pure, disciplined skill, the C-130 peeling away overhead as emergency vehicles converged on the runway below. The cabin erupted the moment the wheels touched, not the panicked screaming of 3 hours earlier, but something closer to disbelieving joy. Passengers cried, hugged strangers, thanked flight attendants who had no idea what to do with the gratitude being pressed on them. In the back of the aircraft, Elena Ruiz sat down hard in the nearest jump seat, radio still clutched in both hands, and finally let herself cry. Investigators would later determine that the failure had been caused by an experimental atmospheric research device operated from a research vessel roughly 90 miles off the flight's track, a system designed to test high-altitude electromagnetic effects that had, through a calibration error, released a pulse many times more powerful than intended. The company responsible faced federal charges within the month. The incident became the subject of an FAA safety bulletin and, within a year, a formal review of backup radio equipment requirements for long-haul aircraft. None of that mattered much to the people who had actually been on Flight 219. What mattered to them was a 15-year-old girl who had refused to sit still and be afraid. Captain Diane Okafor requested, and was granted, the chance to personally present Elena with a commendation from the airline 3 weeks later, in a small ceremony attended by nearly 40 of the flight's original passengers who had flown back out specifically to be there. Robert Hale, the retired captain, gave a short, unplanned speech about 31 years of flying and how he'd never once seen anything like what he witnessed that day. Priya Nair cried through most of it. The volleyball team showed up in matching jerseys and presented Elena with a signed ball, which struck exactly the right note of absurdity and warmth for the room. Marcus Ruiz, granted emergency leave from his deployment to attend, stood in the back and watched his daughter accept a small glass award with her hands shaking again, not from fear this time. Afterward, he found her near the refreshment table, still holding the award like she wasn't quite sure what to do with it. "You did exactly what I taught you," he said. "I was so scared, Dad." "I know." He put a hand on her shoulder. "That's what makes it brave. Doing it anyway." Elena looked down at the little radio, which she'd brought with her, now permanently retired from active service and destined for a shelf instead of a backpack. "Somebody was always listening," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Somebody always is," her father agreed. "You just have to be willing to speak up." 311 people flew home that week because a girl in the back row remembered what her father taught her, and because, somewhere out over an empty ocean, on a frequency almost nobody ever uses, somebody happened to be listening. The Coast Guard would later adopt Elena's relay technique, informally nicknamed the 34F Protocol, by the crew who first heard it happen, as a training scenario for junior communications specialists, how to talk a stranger with zero technical background through a live emergency relay, calmly, clearly, one instruction at a time. Elena kept flying after that. She still gets nervous during turbulence, same as anyone. But she always keeps a charged radio in her bag now, wrapped in the same sweater, just in case. Not because she expects to need it again. Because now she knows what it means when somebody does. Years later, when people asked her about that day, and people did ask, for a long time afterward, at school, at family gatherings, once even at a college interview where an admissions officer had recognized her name from an old news clip, Elena never described herself as brave. She always said the same thing, almost word for word, the way you repeat something so many times it stops being a memory and becomes simply true. I wasn't brave, she'd say. I was just prepared. My dad made sure of that, one boring Saturday at a time, long before I ever needed it to matter. And somewhere, on whatever base he happened to be stationed at that year, Marcus Ruiz kept a small, slightly worn photograph in his wallet, not of the ceremony, not of the commendation, but of Elena at 9 years old, headphones too big for her ears, hunched over an old radio in their garage, concentrating so hard on getting the phonetic alphabet right that she hadn't noticed him taking the picture at all. He never needed to explain to anyone why he carried it. He knew exactly what it meant, and so, now, did the 311 people who came home because of it.